He crossed the Atlantic, fierce, relentless, and armed with iron swords. The Viking people, warriors who had conquered distant shores, found a new land, Vinland. But here, everything was different. The forests were dense, the rivers wild, and in the shadows lurked warriors unlike any they had faced before. Armed with arrows tipped with stone and with deep knowledge of the land, the locals did not rely on brute force. They fought with patience, strategy, and overwhelming numbers. This was not a story of conquest, but of retreat. A forgotten chapter where the Vikings became the hunted. Our story does not begin with war, but with the wind. Around the year 980, a Norwegian sailor named Bjarni Herjolfsson was blown far off course while trying to reach a new colony in Greenland. He glimpsed a new land, green, wooded, full of life, but he never went ashore. Still, his accidental discovery reached the ears of Leif Erikson, son of Erik the Red. Leif was intrigued by the possibility of obtaining timber, a resource desperately scarce in Greenland. Around the year 1000, he bought Bjarni's ship and set out to find this new land. What he discovered surpassed all expectations. He landed in several places, naming them Helluland, the land of flat stones, likely Baffin Island, Markland, the forested land, probably Labrador, and finally, a place so fertile he called it Vinland, the land of wine, for the wild grapes growing there. The rivers teemed with salmon larger than any they had ever seen. The forests were thick and rich in valuable timber. For men from the harsh, frozen edge of the world, Vinland was a true paradise. Leif and his crew of 35 built a small settlement, most likely the site we know today as Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland, and spent the winter there before returning to Greenland with a ship full of timber and grapes. News of Vinland spread like wildfire. This discovery promised wealth, resources, and a bright future. Soon, new expeditions followed. The next voyage was led by Leif's brother, Thorvald. A few years later, a wealthy Icelandic merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni attempted the most ambitious expedition yet, to create a permanent colony. Around the year 1010, Karlsefni set sail with 3 ships and between 130,000 and 160 people. Their goal was not merely exploration, they brought women and livestock with them, proof of their intent to stay. It was then that the Norsemen encountered the native inhabitants, whom they called Skrellingar. The origin of this Old Norse term remains debated. It may have meant people in furs, or perhaps it was a derogatory label, something like screamers or weaklings. These people were the ancestors of today's indigenous groups, such as the Inuit. Although their exact identity is uncertain, they were likely part of the Beothuk people, or related groups such as the Dorset and Thule, who had lived in these lands for thousands of years. The first encounters, described in the Icelandic sagas, were cautious and largely commercial. The Skrælings would arrive by boat, fascinated by the Norse goods, eagerly trading valuable furs for strips of red cloth, which they wore around their heads as bands. Thus began a fragile exchange. The Scandinavians also offered them milk, which was a novelty for the local population. Some historians suggest this may have been a mistake. If the indigenous people were lactose intolerant, as many of them likely were, milk could have made them ill, something they might have perceived as poisoning. Still, this remains speculation. It is worth noting that Thorfinn Karlsefni forbade his men from trading the one thing the locals needed most: iron weapons. Native warriors, armed with tools of stone, bone, and wood, quickly realized the superiority of metal. But Karlsefni understood that arming a potential enemy would be an unwise move. This refusal created tensions that steadily grew. Peace was fragile, and it did not take much to shatter it. The first recorded bloodshed between Europeans and the indigenous peoples of North America was not a grand battle, but a small yet brutal act of violence. It occurred during the expedition of Thorvald Erikson. While exploring the area, Thorvald and his team came across 9 local inhabitants sleeping under 3 leather canopies. For reasons not specified in the saga, the Vikings attacked, killing 8 of them. One of the natives managed to escape and raised the alarm. The Scandinavians realized they were in grave danger. They retreated to the cape and prepared for battle. From the fjord, a group of defenders emerged and launched an attack. The locals fired a volley of arrows before being driven off. Most of the Vikings, protected by their shields, remained unharmed, but one arrow, slipping between a shield and a ship's hull, struck Thorvald in the hand. It is reported that, on his deathbed, he asked his men to bury him on the cape, where he had hoped to build his home. Thorvald Erikson, son of Erik the Red, became the first known European to die in the New World, falling victim to violence inflicted by his own people. With his death, relations with the natives were shattered. The brief period of trade came to an end, and an era of conflict began. Later, an incident at Thorfinn Karlsefni's settlement further highlighted the cultural divide. During a trading session, a bull brought by the Norse broke free from its pen. The natives, who had never seen such a large and noisy animal, were terrified by its roar. In a panic, they scattered, and their fear quickly turned into suspicion. They disappeared for 3 weeks. When they returned, they came back as a prepared military force. The sagas describe several skirmishes, painting a picture of settlers living under the constant threat of attack. The Scandinavians were formidable warriors, but their numbers were small, just a few hundred people, surrounded by a population vastly superior in size. They found themselves isolated on a massive, unfamiliar land, thousands of miles from any hope of reinforcements. The dream of Vinland quickly turned into a nightmare. To understand why the Vikings failed to establish a lasting civilization, one must consider how they fought. This was not merely a clash between the advanced and the primitive, it was a confrontation of weapons, tactics, psychology, and the environment. It wasn't about who had the better gear, but who could fight smarter in the world they lived in. At the forefront stood the Viking warrior, whose main advantage was high-quality iron. A bearded axe could split a shield or helmet. Spears with iron tips could pierce leather armor. For the wealthier men, a double-edged steel sword was both a status symbol and a deadly weapon. For protection, they carried large wooden shields, sometimes covered with leather. The elite could wear chainmail. Their favorite tactic was the shield wall, known as the skjoldborg. On the open fields of Europe, this formation of overlapping shields formed a true human fortress, difficult to break. The Vikings were skilled commanders. Now let's turn our attention to the warriors they faced in Vinland. The natives had no iron. Their weapons were made from available materials: clubs with stone tips, spears tipped with bone, and most importantly, bows and arrows. At first glance, it might seem they stood no chance. How could a stone tip possibly stand against an iron blade? The answer is simple: it didn't need to. The natives never fought the Vikings on their terms. They didn't attempt a head-on attack, knowing that would be suicide. Instead, they waged a different kind of war, a war of speed, surprise, and exhaustion. Their main tactic was quick strikes followed by rapid retreats. They knew their land intimately, every creek, every dense thicket of the North American forests. They could appear out of nowhere, unleash a hail of arrows, and vanish among the trees before the heavily armored Norse could even give chase. Vikings, accustomed to fighting on open fields, now faced an enemy they could barely see against a landscape that seemed alive and hostile. The natives' ranged weapons were perfectly suited for these conditions. They could release volleys of arrows at incredible speed. The goal wasn't to pierce chainmail, but to find its weak spots. An arrow striking the face, leg, or under the arm could be just as deadly as a sword. The constant rain of arrows from all directions could tire, injure, and demoralize the defenders, pinning them to the ground. The shield wall was designed for frontal attacks, not for encirclement by unseen enemies. The psychological impact was immense. The sagas mention that the locals attacked with terrifying war cries. In one key battle, the sagas describe the use of a strange weapon that terrified the Norse. It is interpreted as something like a catapult or a war sling, launching a large dark object, probably a stone wrapped in hide, which made a terrifying sound as it flew through the air. The Vikings, having never seen anything like it, panicked and broke formation, convinced that a supernatural force had struck them. Although no archaeological evidence of such a weapon has been found, the saga demonstrates just how psychologically effective the natives' tactics were. And finally, the harsh mathematics of war. Viking expeditions were small. The largest was Thorfinn Karlsefni's colonizing group, numbering around 160 people. The indigenous population, though not enormous, vastly outnumbered them. For the Norse, each death was a disaster for their tiny community. For the local warriors, losses were acceptable. They could exert pressure endlessly, making life unbearable for the invaders. This was not simply a battle of technology, it was a strategic war. The natives used their knowledge of the land, their numbers, and their tactics to turn the Vikings' strengths against them. The Norse were not cowards. The sagas are full of examples of their defiance. One of the most dramatic stories of Vinland tells of a woman named Freydis, daughter of Thordis Eriksdotter, a ruthless and illegitimate daughter of Erik the Red. Legend has it that during a sudden attack, the Norse began to panic and flee. As they ran past her, Freydis, who was pregnant, shouted at them, "Why are you running from such miserable cowards? If I had a weapon, I am sure I could fight better than any of you." She then seized a sword from a dead Norseman. When the natives approached, she bared one of her breasts and struck it with the flat side of her sword, letting out a fierce battle cry. The sight of this ferocious, pregnant warrior so terrified the attackers that they halted and began to retreat. According to the saga, Freydis single-handedly saved the day. Although historians question the literal truth of this story, it stands as a powerful testament to the oral tradition, showing just how desperate the situation was for the natives. They lived in constant fear, unable to farm or hunt, always watching their surroundings. The sagas reflect this clearly. Thorfinn Karlsefni and his colonists realized that, despite the wealth of the land, they would have to live under the perpetual threat of attacks from its original inhabitants. This constant conflict was compounded by serious logistical challenges. Vinland lay at the very end of a long and dangerous supply chain stretching from North America to Greenland, Iceland, and finally Norway. Every broken tool or lost nail became a serious problem, requiring replacement thousands of miles away. The settlement at Lance o Meadows shows that they engaged in blacksmithing and boat repairs, but their supplies of materials were limited. They could not have survived long-term without a constant flow of provisions, which the small Greenlandic colony simply could not provide. The decision to leave was not made after one final defeat. It was a strategic retreat, a slow realization that the entire venture was not viable. Blood and resources had been too costly, and fear unbearable. 3 years later, Thorfinn Karlsefni gathered the survivors, including his son Snorri, the first known European born in America, and sailed back to Greenland. They had arrived in search of a new home, but found a new war they could not win. The era of Viking expansion had finally come to an end. The Viking departure from North America is often portrayed as a mysterious failure, but it was no mystery. It was a complex situation in which hostile relations played a decisive role. They were not pushed out by a numerically superior force in a single-pitched battle. Instead, the abandonment of the settlement resulted from a combination of challenges, including serious logistical difficulties and fierce resistance from the native inhabitants. Victory belonged to the Skrælings, the first people of this land. They succeeded because they refused to fight on the Vikings' terms. The Skrælings set the rules of engagement, turning the surrounding landscape into a weapon and using their numerical advantage in a relentless war of attrition, against which small, isolated Norse settlements could not endure. This story completely reshapes the traditional view of Europeans' arrival in America. 5 centuries before Columbus, the discovery of the New World did not lead to immediate conquest. It was a tale of resilience and successful resistance by an indigenous people. It serves as a powerful reminder that native populations were not passive victims of history. They actively defended their homes and way of life with skill and strategic thinking. The Vikings left these lands. While sporadic contacts for resources like timber may have continued for some time, large-scale European colonization would not begin for another 5 centuries. The brief but brutal struggle is preserved in the Norse sagas. On this side of the Atlantic, only a few Norse artifacts remain. Found amid the ruins of a small camp in Newfoundland. The Vikings reached a new world, only to find it already inhabited by people who could not be displaced. They learned a lesson that European powers would later ignore. The will of a people to defend their homeland is one of the most powerful forces in history.